My guest today teaches us how to become great game masters.
Welcome to dicegeeks.com tabletop RPG show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is dicegeeks.com tabletop RPG show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Okay, guys, I have an incredible interview today. We're just going to jump right in. Today's guest is a game designer and the host of How to Be a Great Game Master YouTube channel, Guy Sclanders. Guy, welcome to the show.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
Guy, how were you introduced to this wonderful realm of tabletop RPGs?
Wow. It was so long ago. My goodness. To be honest with you, a friend of mine in junior school one day was filling out a character sheet, an AD&D character sheet, so way back when. Mm-hmm. And I kind of said, well, what are you doing? And was rebuffed and sort of said, oh, it's too complicated. It's something. Anyway, after sort of pursuing that for a while, I eventually joined his role-playing group, and that was the start of it. I think I must have been about 11 years old, and I have never looked back since.
No, that's fantastic. So he tried to keep you out of it by saying AD&D was too complex?
Yeah, pretty much. I wasn't particularly the smartest kid around. Mathematics has never been a strong point of mine. But also in that sort of time period, there was quite a bit of stigma around role-playing as well. So it wasn't seen as something that you would want to do necessarily or announce that you were doing it in public type of thing. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I remember all through high school, it was an issue. And we even had our role-playing books confiscated at one stage by the school counselor because of the whole satanic panic wave that washed over the role-playing sort of industry in the mid-90s. Yeah. So, yeah.
Wow.
But, it still didn't dissuade me from role playing.
Yeah. And of course, I remember some of that as well. I never had my books confiscated, thankfully. Right. But I do remember a time when it was hard to tell people what you were doing. And there were some connotations. If you told them you were role playing, they kind of automatically imagined a table with candles and a dark room or something.
Exactly. The summoning of demons and things. Yeah.
Yeah. And very strange time. But then you kept with it. So did you just, what drew you then to Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, I grew up in South Africa, which up until about, I would say maybe 10 years ago, only had one retail store in the entire country that even sold role-playing books to begin with. So I was only ever exposed to the Dungeons and Dragons franchise because that was literally the only book we had in the town. And it was only much, much later, once I had moved to the major city, that I started to realize, hey, there are other role-playing games out there? That's a crazy idea. What do you mean they don't use D20s? But for me, I have always been someone who enjoys working with other people in a creative space. And honestly, I cannot think of any other kind of group activity that is so focused on creating this narrative experience over such a long period of time. And that feeds my creative soul completely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what other games did you branch out into?
At one stage, I remember ordering it by post which took about 6 months to arrive, the West End Star Wars D6 game, which I still maintain is one of the greatest D6 role-playing games out there. It was a lot of fun doing that one. And then slowly, I really enjoyed the Call of Cthulhu system, the percentile system that they have. But to be absolutely fair, the D20 system is, I think, a very robust role-playing system. And my favorite system was D20 Modern, which was based on 3.5 D&D edition. The D20 Modern I still enjoy playing because I think it kind of encapsulated the Dungeons and Dragons core mechanic. And I will play 5th edition, of course, but I feel that 5th edition has moved away from what Dungeons and Dragons was and is almost its own entity now as well. And I think that was a good thing for them. After 4th edition, they had to branch out and go in a different direction, but a better direction. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And just to follow up, you mentioned the West End Star Wars game. That one for me, too, as regular listeners of my podcast will know, was a huge moment for me because it was so simple to play. It was so simple to teach. I didn't have to explain a fantasy world or a Tolkien-esque world to somebody who wasn't exposed to that because everybody I knew had seen Star Wars. And it didn't come with some of the baggage we mentioned earlier. So it was just like, oh, we're playing Star Wars. That's it. Yeah, we're just playing Star Wars.
And I hope it taught you the same life lesson that it taught me is if you take 20 D6 and it's the good old fashioned ones with dots on it rather than numbers, and you throw them in front of me, I can spot count those in about 3 seconds to within a tolerance of about 3 or 4 total points out. Because I remember when you were playing that game, you would roll 7d6 and you'd have to add it together and come up with a grand total type of thing. Yeah. And still to this day, you roll a whole bunch of d6s in me, I'll spot count that puppy and go, yeah, it's about 25. So that was a real benefit to that game. But yeah, I mean, it was a great system. I've moved all over the world. I've lived in Tokyo. I've lived I'm now in the UK. And of the rule books that I have brought with me across the world, that is the rule book that I have still got on my bookshelf, is that good old fashioned blue covered West End, role playing book.
Yeah. And I absolutely agree. When you throw down a whole handful of 6-sided dice, I have like several strategies just to get the number as quickly as possible. Right. And it usually freaks some people out, and they'll be like, "How did you count that so fast?" And it's like, "Look, man, you don't even know. 10d6. That's what I used to have to roll, or 12d6. I used to have to throw that down."
That's it. Because I think even starting characters in the old West End, you would have your basic attribute, which was usually 2d2 plus 2 or 2d6 plus, 2d6 plus 2 or 2d6 plus 3 or 4. And then you'd have your actual skill underneath that, which was often an extra 1d or 2d or 3d. So even at starting level, you were rolling 5d6 and having to add them. Good time.
Yeah, or 66 if you're a bounty hunter and drop 2D into your blaster. Right. So there you go. So 66 right off. So I love that. I love that system, and it was so much fun. It was so much fun to play that one. And then you did mention, though, you said that you felt 5th edition was moving away from kind of the core mechanic of Dungeons and Dragons. Could you explain that a little bit?
So for me, when I played the majority of my role playing Dungeons and Dragons experience, both as a player and a GM, is 3.5 and seconded. I played a lot more second edition than I have a GM second edition, just because by the time I started playing, second edition was already on its way out, and third edition 3.5 was coming in. But I still remember 3.5 and second edition. There was still a dedication to the making the game somewhat real and somewhat deadly. So when your character died, and the classes were unbalanced, but that unbalance was often tempered by strong narrative lines or something along that route. And I kind of always felt that the designers were very passionate about the game, but also passionate about trying to get history right, or at least facts right. I don't know. Fifth edition is very slick and definitely draws obviously from 3.5, but I kind of feel like it's been so balanced and so carefully positioned that it feels to me very, I don't want to say watered down, but it feels almost too easy. Mm-hmm. And you have an adventurer pack, and that comes preloaded with a whole bunch of equipment. And part of me goes, oh, I remember the days. If we hadn't written rope down, we didn't have it. Now we just write down adventurer's backpack, and you have rope and this and this and this. It's like I learned so much about history, survival, preparation for going on adventure, because if you didn't, there were significant ramifications to not doing it. Whereas fifth edition has tried to remove that element. And I can completely understand why as well. Mm-hmm. It's just, to me, it's like, oh, you died. Yeah, well, you just get up a level and you can get this spell which will resurrect easily, or you'll get this one which will do this. And the spell costs are significantly less than what they used to be. And you have more spells, and you have more of this, and you have more of that. And I just tend to find that fifth edition, the mechanics are so convoluted to try and balance everybody out that if you have a whole bunch of level 15 characters fighting each other, if it's 4 people, you can walk away and come back 2 hours later and the battle's still going on, because everyone's using their bonus to do this and their reaction to do that. And then they've got this, and then they've got that, and they've got this, et cetera, et cetera. Where, I don't know, in the old days, it seemed like it was less about all the glitz and glamour and more about just getting on with the job and taking the hard knocks. That's me. And as I say, I have played very little fifth edition as a player. By the stage fifth edition came out, I was the perma GM within my friendship circles. So I suppose my view is skewed a little bit when it comes to that, but
okay.
Yeah.
And, I think it is interesting. You mentioned kind of the, like the adventurers pack. I thought that was interesting too, because I do remember those days of when I had to just look through the equipment list and imagine every type of contingency because
right, you had to plan but not only that is as a human, as a player, you had to anticipate. And so you were forced to go, okay, well, we didn't bring pitons along. What the hell is a piton? I've never gone mountain climbing. I don't know what that is. But then you learn in the game, that's what it is, rather than just having it already given to you on, Anyway, I mean, that's, yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand. And also, though, I mean, it does bring up an interesting point. You said you thought that it got easier in a certain sense, that to make it a little bit more slick and to make it a little bit easier. I think that's an interesting point, because say if you looked at video games,
yes,
there is a similar trend now.
Oh yes,
now controlling, the amount of buttons you press and things, is gotten more complex. Say the analog there, I guess, would be to 5th edition. You got a lot more things you can do with your characters. But if you remember, I assume I'm older than you, but if you played a video game in the mid 80s, they were very difficult. You did not beat video games, right? Like there was one guy somewhere, who has the top score, and it looks like he beat it or something, but you're just like, I don't know that guy. I can barely get, half of that score or something like that.
Exactly.
And so I think there has been a trend of that kind of, in games in general.
I completely agree. I mean, I'm busy playing. There was a computer game called Caesar 3, which is it's a city builder game, right? Mm-hmm. And it came out in 1994, I think. And then they released, as they're doing now, a new trend, of course, is they're taking all the games from then and they're just making them work on modern day machines. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm on level 5 and I can't beat it. And I was getting so frustrated. I'm like, this game is too hard. And then I realized, no. Because when the game came out in 94, I cherished the idea of spending weeks trying to find the exact right way to overcome this thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas, exactly as you say, we're being conditioned as gamers to have less personal difficulty or challenge, I guess, to make it more accessible to the casual gamer as opposed to the hardcore gamer.
Yeah.
And I mean, I am hardly one to talk. I have literally just finished writing a role-playing system that the whole challenge was to make the entire thing revolve around just yes or no. And to have no dice and to have no mathematics. In other words, to make it beyond simple. It wasn't because the person issuing the challenge was lazy. Mm-hmm. It was just that they wanted to get into role playing and didn't want to have to read 5th edition rulebook or Cthulhu rulebook or whatever role playing system is out there. They wanted something very simple that they could just get the idea of role playing in. Mm-hmm. So there is something to be said for complexity. There are some things perhaps that I admit are definitely legacy. I loved weapons and spellcasting having an initiative modifier. I absolutely loved that idea that a giant heavy sword took you longer to swing than a simple rapier. And that was very prevalent in 2nd edition or 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that's something that's been lost personally. Again, to try and balance out the weapons and make everything slick and move. Sure. But anyway, that's just my thoughts.
Yeah. And we'll come back to your game here in a second. But then you were saying you've played very little 5th edition, but you GM a lot of 5th edition. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes. I illegally GM it.
You do what?
I illegally GM it because I don't know the rules. So I'm actually running a 3.5 game, and every now and again my players have to say, "Oh no, we don't use reflex saving throws anymore. It's now a dexterity saving throw." And I go, "Oh, you changed the name? How dramatic." Okay, well, give me a dexterity saving throw then. I will be the first person to raise my hand and say, I remember more 3.5 rules than I know 5th edition rules.
Okay. All right. Well, then I like your phrase there, illegally GM it. Yeah. I like that. But, thinking about this, when we're talking about you gaming, of course, now you're a game designer, and I mentioned that you have a YouTube channel, How to Be a Great Game Master. What kind of led to you, kind of just stepping into the world of sharing some of your GM advice on a YouTube channel?
Yes. Well, so South Africa had, this was in 2010. So I like to say fairly recently, but I realize now that is more than a decade ago. Yes. we had one gaming convention that would happen every year in the main city. And people would travel from all over the country to come and participate. And it was a competitive role-playing event, which ran over 3 days. And you had score sheets, and you got scored based on if you were a player, on how good you were at playing your character and that sort of thing. And if you were a GM, you got scored on just a wide range of things. How good are your NPCs? What's your rules knowledge like? Can you apply the rules to any situation, and so on? And what blew my mind was that when I arrived, the first time I went there, I signed up to be a GM because that's what I was by default. So I didn't see any reason to change it. And when I sat down, they said, "Oh, you're playing a 40K game." And I went, "A 40K game? What do you mean a 40K game?" And they said, "Yes, you're playing Warhammer 40K. I said, "I don't even know what that is. And I've never used the rule system before. I thought this was Dungeons and Dragons only." And they went, No. You've signed up for 40K. And I went, okay, well, I'm out of the competition then because I don't know the rules. I didn't know at that stage the setting or the genre at all. And I called over to a friend of mine at another table and I said, "Give me the rundown. How does 40K work?" And he said, "It's a percentile. Your guys have to roll under the percentile that they have on their character sheet." I said, "Okay, that's fine. Great. What's the universal setting like?" He said, "It's fantasy and space. Everyone wears big armor and screams for the emperor a lot. Orcs are bad, made out of vegetable matter, and there's aliens and there's stuff. It's sort of British." I went, "Okay, cool." And, I ran that game, and then I ran a D&D game and that sort of thing. And for 3 years running, I won the best GM at the event.
Wow.
And I couldn't understand it. Obviously I was getting the score sheets back and this was random people playing with you. So, it's fairly impartial. I'd get the score sheets back and I'd fill in my score sheet and I go, "Oh, okay, I got X out of X," or whatever it was. And I just kept winning, even though I was running games in systems that I hadn't ever learned. And the more I played the different systems, the more I realized the mechanics, for me anyway, and certainly for the people that were scoring me, had less and less to do with the enjoyment of the game and more about just using good old-fashioned storytelling principles. And to put the whole thing into context was in the 4th year, I was busy signing up to play a game, to compete. And this young GM was standing there and he said, "Oh, are you signing up?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Oh, well, then there's no point in me signing up because you're just going to win."
Oh.
And I went, "Well, that's not the point." So I immediately stopped competitive play. I withdrew from the competition. And acted as a backup GM. So if they needed someone to run a game, I'd just run a game as a volunteer. But it got me thinking, what was the differentiator? Because I was a newcomer to that particular scene. I had come from a rural town, so no one kind of knew who I was. How was it that I managed to come in and take this space without even knowing the rules of the role-playing games that I was running? Mm-hmm. My background is script writing. So I used to work as a script writer for film and television in South Africa. And I just used to use my script writing principles when I was telling and running games. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to make a video on how I run my game and on my principles of storytelling that I have learned as in my career. And maybe that'll help people to have more fun at their games. And so I made 2 videos, which are still up on the channel. They're the first 2 videos that we have, and showed them to the South African folk, and they were very polite, and they watched them and that sort of thing. But nothing really happened for about 6 months, I think. And then someone came across the video on YouTube, as they do, and shared it on Reddit, and it went viral overnight, and we suddenly had 2,500 subscribers the next morning. And I went, wow, okay. And started reading the comments and things and realized that a lot of people did not have the benefit of having gone through film school and learned about narrative structure, but we're wanting to role play. And so the rule books that you have, there's sometimes a section in the back which says how to run an adventure, but it's more along the lines of, you have a first act, you have a second act, you have a third act, and good luck to you, and have fun. It doesn't talk about all of the other elements that you really need to have. And from what I have seen, all it's done is inculcate in people a sense that you have to plan everything in advance before you can do anything, which I realized very early on, that's not the way, for me anyway. And so yeah, that is the very long story of how I got into doing the YouTube channel.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And there's a few things in there that, I'd like to talk about a little bit. I mean, first, running a game that you haven't read the rules for. I've done that as well. Right. And, and it is interesting that a lot of people, would be like, shrieking in horror, thinking that how they would do that. And I don't know. I just find it kind of interesting because, that's the way, I first started running games. I was 9 when I first played D&D, and I played one time, and then the next day I ran my mom through a dungeon, and like I didn't know any of the rules, so like I ran D&D without reading them. Why would I have to read another, another game, right? Yes. And then also, you were mentioning it's interesting you had a career in screenwriting, because when I went to college, I studied screenwriting.
Right.
And I never really was able to turn it into a full career, but I did a lot of, kind of guerrilla filmmaking and writing a number of screenplays and, taking, small movies to film festivals and things like that. And, I do find it interesting. I think sometimes when I'm talking to somebody or giving them GM advice, I think I do forget that that I studied stories in college, right? And
absolutely,
and that some people, they're an accountant and they never really thought about that. And so I know sometimes I kind of forget about that a bit. Do you have just a couple keys? Like, what would somebody need to understand about story? I know this is a topic that we could talk about for like, I don't know what, like 100 years, but
yes, I would say about 100 years. I mean, I have 600 videos on the subject of how to do it. So yes, there is. I would say the biggest key personally is about expectation. Mm-hmm. And if you can figure out what your players are expecting, you can give it to them. But because you know what they're expecting, you can give it to them in an unexpected way. Mm. And so, for example, if we say 40K Space Marines, that first game that I ran, I was like, okay, they're expecting to be these soldiers in space fighting against vegetable orcs, because the orcs in 40K are based from fungus, and aliens. Okay, well, I've watched the movie Aliens. So what do I expect when I see aliens? I expect horrific environment. I expect random people to get mauled and mutilated. I expect the alien to be super powerful and deadly and to hunt the party. So that's what I expect. So by extension, I assume a lot of other people will expect that as well. Great. Mm-hmm. So now how do I give that to them, but then completely change it? And a very easy way to do this is to go, well, what if instead of the alien doing grisly stuff to them, they're doing grisly stuff to the aliens? And they're invading the alien's nest and the aliens are powerless. So if we turn it on its head, where does that go? Maybe that's not so interesting. Okay, let's try something else. Maybe it's broad daylight and it's not so dark and scary. Maybe it's just lots of aliens, and then you just start running through all of the different ways that you can change stuff. But if you know what the players are expecting, you have a very solid base to work from. And what we lose, unfortunately, with online role playing through Zoom and Discord and that sort of thing, is we lose the ability for our players to tell us what they're expecting. Because when you're playing around a table, and this was a technique that I used to use a lot with my players, is you'd be sitting there and you'd go, okay, they're all in a tavern. I haven't planned anything for the session. I have no notes. I have nothing. And you just need to sit quietly for a moment. And one of the players invariably will say, oh, I hope we don't have to fight any spiders because I've got nothing to do. I've got no antidotes. Okay, guess what? You are now going to be fighting spiders. I hadn't had that plan, but that's what you're expecting. So I'm going to give you spiders, but the spiders are not going to have poison. The spiders are going to have sticky webs. It's the things that are farming the spiders that are going to have poison. So you still are going to be facing your worst fear, but it's not from spiders. The spiders is a setup that, oh, I thought it was going to be spiders and it's spiders. Yes, but they're not the things you're going to be afraid of. So that banter that happens. Also, and another good technique to have happen, and this is what I use when I'm doing digital VTT calls and things, is I'll say, all right, guys, let's just take a 5-minute break, buy a break, go and get coffee or go and get whatever you want to drink and eat. And then you just sit quietly and you just listen to the guys. As the GM, you should be talking less than your players. There are 4 or 5 or 6 of them, and there's only one of you. That's the ratio that should happen as well in terms of talking, because they will tell you what they're expecting, and then you just give it to them, but in ways that they couldn't anticipate. And sometimes you just give it to them, and they'll go, "Oh, I knew it was going to be a dragon. I knew it." That's as satisfying as them going, "It was a what, or was it this?"
I couldn't agree more, because I actually wrote a book called The No Prep Game Master, a little book. And I put this in there and I called it Listen to the Table. Yes. I think it is so critical to hear what your players are telling you and then taking that in some way. And you were touching on a couple things right there, that they're having an expectation. Well, then you subvert it some way, you change it some way, or you just give it to them. And they think they're geniuses, right?
Yes.
They think they're geniuses, and that the game master is like the greatest. They think that you are like the greatest, game master ever, because they're like, oh my gosh, you thought of this crazy stuff that that we didn't understand, and I figured it all out.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I love that, and I love that you mentioned that, because I think that is such an incredible tool for the game master. And I think you are right that, when we're hopping on a Zoom call and we're starting up our game, that it's everybody's kind of quiet and waiting for the game master to get started. And you're just like, sometimes I do feel like, oh no, I didn't hear what they were thinking about this week. And, it can be, it can be a bit frustrating there.
No, I agree. And I think the other thing that comes along with expectation is there seems to be an expectation that the GM is also responsible for creating the adventures. Yes. And for creating those amazing stories.
Yes.
And people always say to me, "Oh, that was an amazing adventure. Thank you so much." And I sit back and I say, "No, thank you. Mm-hmm. It's because of you, the players, that the adventure existed. I'm not writing a novel." And I think sometimes GMs get wrapped up in the idea that they have to create this amazingly mind-blowing story on their own.
Yes.
That is absolutely untrue. They are not on their own. And the problems come in when they believe that they have to fulfill their vision to be considered a great game master. It's the hobby is collaborative by its nature. And people seem to forget that sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is so important as well. That years ago when I first started, I thought that was the case, right? And I would try to spend a lot of time preparing these great stories, trying to imagine the plots and things and where to take people. And I realized that was unsustainable once I had a family and and responsibilities and that. And it's kind of interesting too that here on the podcast, I like to spread out and interview people who deal with stories, and so I've had a couple recent interviews where I was talking to a film director and to a television director, and there's a common theme, and they always say that the great story they feel comes from the characters, and so I think that is. Something that a game master can learn too is that while your players are creating their characters, you're going to use some of the dynamism that they put in their characters to help the story just to leap out from them, instead of saying something like, okay, I have this great quest and you're going to go on this thing and you're going to go here and go here and go here. It's just like, let those characters just kind of rise up. And what are these things in their backstory? What kind of people are they? What kind of individuals? Let all these things that the players have created, let that help build the story out.
Yes, and when you sit back and look at it, you go, well, actually, once you've got those principles in mind, it's really not that difficult.
Yeah,
to run a game.
Yeah,
you're more of a conductor than a performer.
Sure. No, absolutely. I think that's, one of my goals with my little book that I wrote was to try to take pressure off people who are like, oh, well, I've been playing for 8 years, but there's no way I can run a game. And you're just like, what? like, of course you can. You don't even have to have played to run a game,
exactly. Yeah.
And, I just find that interesting too. And also say, like, running a session, some months back, I ran a Curse of Strahd for a long time. We had a really long campaign and I ran that. And one of my players was a paladin. He was a paladin of kind of, an oath and stuff that I'm not very familiar with. I know I can trust him. Just tell me the rules. What are the rules for your character, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And he just tells me, and I know he's my friend. He's not lying to me or anything. And I say, oh, okay, well then roll a 20 and plus 7 or whatever
exactly.
Whatever the rule is. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I just find that, that interesting that if we do a PSA right here for all people who are game mastering, you don't have to know all the rules. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to think of it all ahead of time. You can let your players help you create the world that you're playing in and the adventure, and listen to them and then use what they tell you at the table.
Exactly. And I think, for me, the biggest testimony of that, and I don't know if I should say this, but it's been long enough now that I think no one will care, was a couple of years ago, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition released a new book called The Ghosts of Saltmarsh.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked me to run their official stream on their Twitch channel for Ghosts of Saltmarsh.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of went, I'm sorry, you want me to run your Dungeons & Dragons game? You are aware that I don't know how to play 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And I'm on record for saying that I don't use modules.
Mm-hmm.
And they went, yeah. But we just do it. And so I then was in a very awkward position where I was like, well, I suppose I actually have to read the setting book. Because they're paying me to run their. Yeah, so they're paying me, so I should at least read their book and understand what was happening and what they were trying to do. And it was interesting that I probably used about 5 names from the book, and that was about it. And I drew inspiration from it, but I didn't follow it along. And it was so successful that they're like, okay, cool. Well, we're doing another book called Descent into Avernus, which I refuse to even pronounce correctly. I call it Avernus, not Avernus. But they're like, oh, that's okay. You do what you're doing. And I'm like, okay, cool. And again, I even I had maps I commissioned new maps because I didn't like the maps that they had. And you go, so here is this giant company, and they're saying it's okay for the GM to not know the rules and to not even use the material because we're still going to get a good game regardless. And for me, that was a major kind of testament to the fact that you don't have to know the rules to have a good game.
Yeah. No. Yeah, absolutely. And I know I don't usually use modules either, but I decided to use Curse of Strahd a while back. I couldn't help myself because at some point, right, the Kraken shows up and things that aren't in the book, know, because I used basically the basic thing, and the first few sessions maybe followed the story as it was, and then it just broke off into a lot of my own stuff. I just think that it's just, I don't know. I talk about it in my book a little bit too. It's just using modules kind of as written is actually a lot of work.
It is.
Yeah.
Absolutely is.
And so using them to get ideas or inspiration from, or take maps out of and use in your, those things are phenomenal. Those are using them, an adventure module or a campaign, guide in those ways is incredible. But it is a lot of work to actually run a module, as written.
Yeah.
But now, you had started mentioning a while ago, a game that you had designed, and you mentioned that it was diceless. Could you tell us what's the name of that game and tell us a little about that?
Yeah, my greatest sin. As someone who owns thousands of dice, I like dice. My partner is a big gamer, but never role played. And it was in January of this year. I was saying, let's try some role playing. Let's see what it's like. And he said, he wants to role play. There's no doubt about it. But the rule books for Dungeons and Dragons is pretty hefty and all that kind of stuff. Is there not an easier system? And I went, well, there's West End D6 Star Wars. And he's like, yeah, it's still a thick rule book. I'm like, well, it's like 300 pages. I wouldn't call that a thick rule book, but sure. And I even went so far as there was a game by Steve Jackson called The Fighting Fantasy, which was a single D6 and very, very simple. And he went, yeah, I just want a role-playing game where it's just yes or no. And I said, that's not possible. I said, it's impossible. It's just, you just can't. That's not a role-playing game. That's a I don't know what that is, but it's not a role-playing game. And I even made a video about it where I was like, well, we talk about designing, role-playing games and what goes into it. And I said, could you have something that's a yes or no solution? And what happens, and again, this is just because I think my brain is just hyperactive. I was thinking about it going, well, how could you do it? How could you do a yes or no type of situation? And I got to thinking and got to working and it just wouldn't go away. And so then I wrote down some ideas. And bearing in mind, I have been writing little role-playing homebrew rules since second edition. The very first not rule book, because that makes it sound like it was complete, but the very first set of rules I wrote was a pirate game for second edition Dungeons and Dragons, where we worked out sailing ships and all that kind of stuff. So I've been doing this for a very long time, but never with the intention of not using any dice and just yes or no. And so it rattled around in my head, and we did some play testing of the idea that I had, and went, well, this is actually pretty cool. Because when you research diceless role-playing games, there are not a lot that come to the fore. And I had managed to meet a game designer from Finland at a Finnish gaming convention a couple of years ago who had written a diceless role-playing system. So I had a little bit of experience with that. And I went, okay, well, hang on, I don't particularly like that approach because it was a little bit too academic. And there's some other approaches out there, which I said, well, could I use playing cards? But really, playing cards is still a random number generator. This had to be binary. It had to be yes or no. And so, yeah, after a lot of play testing, I eventually in February, I think, had a working system, launched it as a Kickstarter for reasons of insanity. And we did a poll and we said, well, what setting should it be? Should it be fantasy? Should it be sci-fi? Should it be this or that? And the fans came back and said, no, let's make it bounty hunters in space. And I mean, that's a pretty cool setting straight off the bat. Automatically took me to the Star Wars D6 system as well. So for me, it was very nostalgic. And I went, okay, cool, let's do this. So having the setting then really helped to refine the rule sets. I had already written a magic system, which I had to chuck out because it didn't fit in the sci-fi sort of setting. And so we had this working skeleton of a role-playing game. And the Kickstarters, I invited them to play test it, and I play tested with many of the Kickstarters as well. And it grew and it expanded a little bit, and it grew a little bit more. But now it's a 40-page rule book, and that includes about 22 pages, 23 pages of character creation and example NPCs and monsters and things. So it's a really, really rules light system. But whenever I play it at the end of a 3-hour session, people sit back and go, wow, we just had a great adventure and we didn't roll any dice, but we were still under incredible pressure. We were making decisions that were make or break. Things still didn't go our way. And yet none of the rules got in the way. So that's what Bounty Hunter is. It's this absolutely light role-playing system where everything is designed to make the narrative better and not to destroy great role-playing because of a dice that just a die that just decides to roll a natural one. And yeah, I am incredibly proud of it, I must admit, because it turned into something much bigger than its initial intention was. And so far, I haven't had anyone go, no, this is a waste of time. So fingers crossed, it continues.
No, and it sounds really fascinating. Could you give, say, an example? Like, how is it exactly based on like a yes or no question?
Right. So the only way that I could think of, and I'm sure there are dozens of other ways, but your character sheet, you have one score that you have to keep track of, and that is called your action point pool. So you have your AP. So to do anything, you have to have a skill for it. So if you want to fire a blaster, you have to have the range skill. If you don't have the range skill, you can't fire a blaster. So that kind of starts getting you to the yes-no solution. But in order to use your skill, and it doesn't matter which skill it is, but to use your skill costs you 1 AP. So from your pool of most starting characters have 20 AP. From your 20 AP, to fire that blaster once takes 1 AP. You will automatically hit. There is no chance that you will miss. There is no chance that something will go wrong with your attack. You will hit your target by spending 1 if you have the ranged attack. So that's the yes or no. There is no variable. There is no degree of success. It is either yes, you hit it and you spend 1 AP, or no, you don't hit it and you don't spend 1 AP. Combat is measured by the fact that if you take a dodge action, you will dodge, and the person who is firing at you will miss even though they have spent 1 AP. It's not a gray area. The person shooting doesn't have more skill, so your dodge chance is less. It's just a flat up. If you dodge, you're not attacking that round, So that's your action. So it's very, very, very simple kind of stuff, except that when you start looking at combat, for example, each character only has 20 action points per day. And in a combat, just to fire your weapon takes 1 AP. So you're automatically taking damage when you're taking an action in the sense of taking damage. But for example, being hit by a standard blaster pistol, that does 7 AP damage to the character. So your 20 points drain away really, really quickly. So you want to avoid combat. But avoiding combat requires you to use other skills like stealth and negotiation and observation. So your points are still going down. So what you're facing in this game, the tension is, I know I could succeed if I did this, but if I didn't do this and I fail, I would be able to do something later on because I still have action points. So it's about trying to gauge when to use your action points to succeed and when to not spend your action points and actually allow a failure to happen, and to then deal with the consequences of the failure and hope that you can turn it around to your advantage. So that is it in a nutshell, effectively. And then we just made sure that every single mechanic, because there's rules on Starship Combat, which is really fun. Every player can participate in Starship Combat, even if they haven't taken specific Starship rules. That was a take home that I took from the Star Wars West End games, was that Jedi at very early level had to focus on Jedi stuff. Mm-hmm. And so if you put them in a starship, they couldn't fire a single starship weapon. They just didn't have the skills available. So the Jedi player would go, oh, it's a starship battle. I go and sit and play chess whilst everyone else has fun. So I made sure that in this system, your skill set is almost irrelevant when it comes to starship combat. You will be able to contribute in some kind of way. So from... when people hear that, they go, oh, yeah, but I mean, is it really going to be that interesting? And then they play it and they're like, I didn't know that failing could be so fun and force me to think so hard, but at the same time, tell such a great story. Because on the face of it, it's like you can succeed at whatever you're trying to do, mm-hmm. except when you choose not to succeed. And that creates a whole bunch of interesting questions.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. And I think there is always a tension between sometimes and of course, we're playing in, fantasy, unrealistic worlds and things, but there are, times, where, as a GM, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I don't think your character would have felt comfortable, shooting somebody in the street, right? Like, because in real life, like that just doesn't happen very often, right? Like, and okay, maybe it's a frontier town or something like that, but it's just, it's just like that usually has consequences, like big immediate consequences, like, people, bystanders, tackling you or, arresting you or something, or killing you because you're out of control or something. Exactly. So I think that is an interesting idea, always kind of making the players kind of decide between, do I just shoot the person or do I try to talk to them now, or do I sneak up behind them, as they're leaving the cantina or
there is that. What compounds that is that, and this is the age-old problem that a lot of people have had with most role-playing games, mm-hmm. is that your character has a certain amount of hit points or life points. Mm-hmm. And most games these days, your character is 100% effective until they reach 0. So they can be losing hit points, but they will still do as much damage and they will still be able to leap and jump for infinity until they reach that 0 hit point state. Whereas in Bounty Hunter, if you want to jump, that's going to cost you 1 AP. Mm-hmm. So go ahead and shoot that guy in the street. You will hit him because you know that you will. But will you have enough AP to run away from that mob for the entire day? The answer is no, you won't. So you've got to think, as you say, consequences, but it's even longer consequences. Like, sure, run to your starship, but you don't actually have enough AP to then avoid the space patrol that's going to be trying to arrest you. So suddenly, as in with real life, you're going, I'm not Superman. I can't do everything in a day that these super characters would do. I have very hard limits, and I need to take those limits into account. Anyway.
No, that's fascinating. That's really that's really interesting. And I know exactly what you're talking about with the hit point things acting normal until then. And I thought that was really great in the Star Wars West End system, where you were to subtract a D from your attributes or your skills if you're wounded, and and so on down the line. That was a new concept to some people I played with, because they were like, hey, I have one hit point. I should be able to do everything my character does. And I remember that. So Bounty Hunter sounds really interesting. And I have not played a diceless system, so that is, kind of intriguing to me. And I'm just kind of wondering too, I guess, with the diceless system, I kind of like the idea of randomness and rolling a 1, because like you're in the middle of some big military operation and you roll a 1. Well, I mean, it's just like the helicopter crashes during the Osama bin Laden raid or something like that. It's just things happen in life that just bring that up. And I know my players don't like it, but for me as a GM, I feel it gives me like those complications that you can really, this is the scene in the movie where everything's going bad for the hero, right?
Right. And you are absolutely right. The moment you remove random number generator from the system, you go, well, where is the randomness? Where is that chance event coming in from? And for the first few sessions, or at least for the first few minutes into a session, people just assume that, well, we can succeed at everything. And you go, yes, you can. Okay, cool. Well, then we'll just go straight into that camp with the helicopter and we'll just succeed. And you go, yes. And now you've run out of hit points, or you've run out of AP points, and now you're being arrested because you cannot succeed any further. You can't run. You literally cannot run. You are physically exhausted and fatigued to the point that you cannot move. So now you're being arrested. Now you're being taken into prison. And you will have to rest the night and recover some of those AP points and try and get them back the next morning. And then you have to try and break out. So the random element, yes, it is definitely something that is not in the game. At the same time, I have had so many role-playing games where the character gives, and the player, more than the character, the player gives this eloquent speech on how they're trying to motivate the troops, and then they roll a 1. And you're forced to go, well, your actual speech as a player moved me, but the dice say that your character mumbled and fumbled and didn't affect anyone. So I've oftentimes seen good role playing be completely erased by bad dice rolling. So I think, whenever you're looking at game design, one of the core principles that I learned very, very early on was that a game is as entertaining as the number of decisions that you have to make on your turn. So if you are making 100 decisions a turn, that's impossible. It's too many decisions for you to try and keep in your head and to try and factor. And so the game becomes unenjoyable. If you look at a game of chess, for example, if you're just playing casually, you're making maybe 3 or 4 decisions because you're trying to work out your moves. If you play against a grandmaster, they're keeping everything going in their heads on the same turn. If you're making too little decisions, the game is also very dull and uninteresting because it becomes repetitive very quickly. So as long as you are making decisions, the game in theory should still be enjoyable. So random dice cause you to have to make decisions based on random outcomes. Bounty Hunter, you're making decisions on limited outcomes. So yes, you feel it, but after a while, you don't even notice that it's missing.
Yeah. No, that sounds very interesting, and yeah, just a very cool take on it. Now, I could ask you a ton more questions about running games and that, but I will respect your time. Where can people find your videos and find bounty hunters?
So the best place to head to is our website, which is www.greatgamemaster.com. So that's greatgamemaster.com. And that links through to our to our YouTube channel, which is How to Be a Great GM, as well as to the books, the PDF of Bounty Hunter, which literally is only on sale from the Monday of this recording. So quite fresh. By the time this recording comes out, of course, it'll be on sale for quite some time.
Okay. All right. And I will put a link to your website and your YouTube channel and to Bounty Hunters in the show notes for this episode. So anybody who is listening to the podcast right now can head over to dicegeeks.com and you'll find the show notes for this episode. And you can check out Guy's YouTube channel and Bounty Hunters. Well, Guy, it was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Guy today. He dropped some bombs on us how we can be great game masters. If you didn't pick up some tips from this episode, I don't know what you are doing, because Guy brought wisdom today. Now, as I mentioned in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, you will find links to Guy's YouTube channel, How to Be a Great Game Master, as well as his game, Bounty Hunters. Definitely check both of those out. All right, guys, here's the drill. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in the world of Dice Geeks. Hey guys, also, if you enjoy this show, consider supporting it in some way. You can like, rate, subscribe, or review an episode of this podcast wherever you are listening to it. Those things take you just a few seconds and they help the show immensely. And I would greatly appreciate it if you did one or more of those things. Also, if you are in a position to support the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/dicegeeks. You can join my other fantastic patrons there. Now, guys, it is a privilege to be able to come to you each and every Wednesday with a new fantastic interview. I thank you so much for listening to the show. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming.